You fool! Warren is dead.
Welcome to HorrorBabble. I'm back today with a new Van Melsen tale. In case number 15, The Silence of Black Edge, our fearless PI investigates a silence not of this world, where forgotten rites and lurking shadows hunger for the living. I haven't made as much progress on the novel as I would have liked. It's been one of those years, so I felt it necessary to complete another short. And a quick reminder that the second volume of Van Melsen's stories is now available in ebook format. I've included some links below. And if you've had a chance to pick up either of the books, I'd be truly grateful if you could leave a rating or review. It makes a big difference in helping more readers discover the books. You'll find a link to the Van Melsen playlist below, too. Thanks all. I hope you enjoy this new offering. The Silence of Black Edge by Ian Gordon. Reluctantly printed in the Buxton Gazette, April 6th, 2020. Part 1. John Duffy's Account. Strange Goings-On at Black Edge by John Duffy. We're no strangers to strangeness here in the Peak District. We've seen it all. The Derbyshire Triangle, the Mermaid of Blackmere Pool, ghost planes, haunted caves, the list goes on. But it was a routine trip to the infamous Miller's Manor that set off a chain of events that would lead to the writing of this article. 30 years had elapsed since the terrible events of 1989-90, so I was visiting the house primarily to write an article on the subject, to take some photographs, to do what a journalist does. In spite of what happened there all those years ago, Miller's Manor receives hundreds of annual visitors. People flock from all over the world to gawp at that pile of red bricks, to wander its damp halls and dusty rooms, looking for ghosts, spectres of those who lost their lives, at the hands of persons unknown. And it was there, in the gloomy sepia foyer, that I met my soon-to-be companions for the next 24 hours or so. The first of these two was a thin, rangy character with a gaunt face and slicked-back dark hair. He wore a rather ostentatious black overcoat, and looked, for all intents and purposes, like a man dressed for one of the many murder mystery weekends the mansion had once hosted. It took only a moment to realize that this was the famed paranormal investigator, Peter Van Melsen. At his side, as unlikely a companion as you might imagine, stood a young lady of some 20 years, with jet-black hair and a luminous pale face, mostly drowned by an oversized sweater. The pair, it transpired, were passing through Millersdale on their way to Dark Peak, where, the investigator went on to say, a highly localized phenomenon had been brought to his attention. Like myself, the pair had received special permission to spend the night at Miller's Manor, Van Melsen stating that the rarefied atmosphere peculiar to the place was in some way to prime him and his colleague for their forthcoming trip to the moors. Rarefied atmosphere? I asked, immediately drawn in. The events of 30 years ago left an indelible mark, he said, his voice low and sharp. The sensitive among us must tread carefully in such places. The vague words of an occult detective. I simply nodded, smiling politely. The girl seemed to sense my insincerity. She scowled at me. I returned a flustered frown. She shook her head. Now, I'm not sure how I managed it, but I succeeded in becoming a third wheel, ambling through the old house alongside the curious pair, studying their subtle examinations, straining to observe their whispered exchanges. The two of them have history together, of course, and as I followed them into the mansion's library, still filled to the brim with priceless, and for the most part faceless volumes, I recalled bits and pieces I'd read of Van Melsen's adventures, one or two of which I was sure concerned a young girl matching his companion's description. Ellen Moore, the girl who had ostensibly received visions of those about to die, had sketched them in their death throes at the command of something ancient and unappealingly subterranean. England's a funny old place, isn't it? The land of 1,000 monsters, and yet so rarely seen. In the library, poorly lit, with the sound of an insistent gale blowing through some unseen aperture in the far wall, Van Melsen and Moore seemed to carry out some sort of ceremony. I say ceremony, because I can think of no other word to describe their actions. The pair seemed to huddle together by a handful of hastily lit candles. The investigator read in a low murmur from a small notebook. Moore shivered, as though an army of ghosts had trotted across her grave. What they were hoping to achieve, I hadn't the foggiest. So far, I've written as a skeptic might. It's my job, after all. But I have to admit that the silence into which we were plunged in that library was something alien, something I've never experienced before. It was almost uncomfortable. In fact, no, it was uncomfortable. The kind of silence that made movement impossible, filling you with the idea that if you happened to shift, a twist of the neck, a flick of the wrist, the resulting sound would be painful to your ears, intolerably painful. The sensation lasted a couple of seconds that felt like an hour, then quickly passed, ended as it was by the marvelously cheerful tones of the investigator. "How are you finding it so far?" he barked at me, a toothy grin all I could see in the semi-darkness. "I'm sorry," I said, a little out of my depth. "Your first paranormal investigation," he clarified, approaching. I stammered, swallowed, no words. "You've a curious eye," he went on, coming within a stride of me. "Perhaps you'll accompany us on the morrow." Staring and inexplicably convinced for reasons beyond my reckoning, I said, "Sure." Moore approached, observing me like a cautious cat. "Sure," I repeated, with a little more enthusiasm. "Where are we off to again?" But of course I knew where they planned to go on the morrow. Dark Peak, specifically Black Edge, just north of Buxton. That eerie fell along whose sharp ridgeline hikers tramped day after day. What they were after up there, I had no idea, but there was something in Peter Van Melsen's demeanor and furtive mannerisms that promised a story of some kind, if I had it in me to stick it out with them for a couple of days. And so I dined with the pair in the old kitchen, and we shared our stories, that of the tireless paranormal investigator, that of the young, scrupulous student, and that of the diligent, if often frustrated, small-town journalist. I should add that the rarefied atmosphere Van Melsen spoke of became more and more apparent as the day went by, like a velvet sheet pulled slowly over a prostrate body, warm and oppressive, marked by the stains of past atrocities, violence and pain. But there were no ghosts, no ghouls, just that tangible something that filled the very air. "What exactly do you expect to find up there?" I asked, spurred on by my third glass of red wine. "That's a difficult question to answer," Van Melsen said, lighting a cigarette with great care. "The lady who contacted me was rather vague in describing the thing at hand. A great silence, she said. A silence that wasn't there before. A silence that filled her with dread." "Like the silence in the library?" "Precisely," he said, and I think I caught a subtle widening of the eyes, as if to suggest that he was surprised at my perception. He looked to Moore. The young lady held a glass of wine in one hand and a pencil in the other. She was sketching large dark circles, circles within circles, circles like moons orbiting planets. "Miller's Manor wasn't our first stop," she said, continuing to scribble. "There's an old house in Wakefield. We found a pocket there, too." "A pocket?" I asked. It was the obvious question. "A pocket of silence," Van Melsen replied. "I'm not sure I follow." "Nor should you," he said. "Not yet, anyway." Cold feet. That's what I felt then. Pockets of silence. What on earth was I getting myself into? We hit the sack early, ridiculously early. Van Melsen insisted that an early rise was essential. A car had been booked for 3 a.m. the following morning, a car that would drive us directly to Dove Holes, just northeast of Blackedge. The reported pocket of silence was present at dawn, apparently, and so it was crucial to be there and established prior to the advent of first light. As I lay there that night, I tried not to give too much thought to the history of the room I occupied, a room branded Scarlet Darter, the room that had once hosted the Polish participant of Murder at Miller's Manor, Artur Chaklowski. I tried very hard not to think about what had happened to Art on the eve of December 29th, 1989, but, well, it's just human nature, isn't it? The so-called Mrs. Smith, a pseudonym if ever there was one, who'd recently acquired the old house, emerged from a room above me a little after 8 p.m. I heard the telltale sound of stilettoed heels descending wooden stairs. Doors were pushed to with creaking care. Footsteps echoed along 100 corridors. Voices chirped and cackled. Was Mrs. Smith a woman of 1,000 voices? Or had she other guests with her, characters in a game, attempting to rekindle the spirit of the place? Who knows? I only knew that I had no desire to meet Mrs. Smith. Our arrangements had been made via email. Nor did I wish to come face to face with her guests, likely masked and brimming with frivolity. No thanks. I'd already overstayed my welcome. This I now realized as I stared at the elaborate chandelier above my head, wide awake, my mind awash with another's memories, another's final moments. And then silence. That same impenetrable silence. Please, I begged as I lay there staring up at the chandelier. Please, if anyone is out there, Mrs. Smith or whoever else, please don't make a sound. I can't bear it. My ears can't bear it. My heart can't take it. But there was a sound that inched its way across the wooden floor of the bedroom, a sound that dragged itself up the bedpost and crawled with the pace and inefficiency of a snail across the thick sheets. There was a shape down there, an indistinguishable grey shape gliding towards me. I swallowed stealthily, and then, as whatever it was that crept towards me came into contact with my motionless frame, I gasped. The gasp broke the silence, and the grey, creeping thing, much to my relief, seemed to evaporate. Only then did I sleep. The driver of the ancient Swedish estate car that waited for us on the gravel driveway the following morning was assuredly a Karen of the modern world, a psychopomp, bearded, robed, quiet. Van Melsen greeted the man with the warmth of familiarity, ushering Moore into the back alongside him. I had the good fortune to be awarded the passenger seat, shoulder to shoulder with the ferryman. And off we went, leaving Mrs. Smith and her sprawling pile to whatever the remainder of the long night had in store for them. A short drive delivered us to Dove Holes, over which dark clouds gathered in menacing groups. No rain fell, though. Van Melsen dropped a number of coins into the grey hand of the quiet driver, and we clambered out onto the cold outskirts of town. I wasn't exactly prepared for the journey ahead, but was at least outfitted in a decent winter coat, and took solace in the fact that it was a mere 20-minute walk to the summit from the A6. My camera was on hand, despite the investigator assuring me there would be nothing to see. Nothing to see? I said dismissively. There's always something to see. The investigator raised his eyebrows at this, and then nodded, apparently having changed his mind on the subject. I wasn't sure what he carried in that satchel of his, other than the small notebook I'd seen at the mansion the day before. I was slightly taken aback by the fact that neither he nor Moore carried any luggage with them. Was that unpleasant odor in the air the result of a lack of hygiene, or was something lying dead in the bushes some distance away? Then again, the man Karen might well have collected their luggage prior to my rising that morning. Forgive me, both of you, for my crude surmising. Nevertheless, it was I who trudged along with a backpack on my shoulders, cursing it with every step. It was maddeningly weighed down with books and camera paraphernalia. We reached Black Edge without much ado, and found ourselves looking out into total blackness. Van Melsen held the only torch, and seemed to find it amusing to switch it on and off for extended periods, as though gauging his ability to see in the dark. The cloud cover overhead was absolute, allowing not a single ray of moonlight to penetrate it. "This way," Van Melsen commanded of a sudden, and took off at a fair march along the ridge. Moore and I followed, she at his back, myself taking up the rear. It was about then that I began to feel vulnerable. Nobody wants to be at the back of the pack. You want to be up front, with the eyes of your companions on you, or at the very least in the middle of the group, protected by bodies on both sides. And yet there I found myself, hobbling along, agonizingly aware of my vulnerability, and aware now of something else, some other living thing, creeping along the ridgeline with us. Was it the same thing that had come to pay me a visit in the guest room last night? The grey thing that had crawled along the wooden floor and onto the bed? I began, stammering. "Peter!" I shouted. Instantly the investigator stopped and turned around. Casually, he withdrew a cigarette and lit it, his angular face briefly illuminated by orange flame. "What is it, John?" he asked, throwing the torchlight towards me. "It's just," I said, hesitating, "it's just, I feel like we're not alone up here." "Go on," he said, puffing on the cigarette. "I can hear... No, that's not it. I sense something. It's back there," I added, pointing along the ridge towards the gloom that preceded me. Moore approached then, squinting to get a good look at my eyes. "Peter," she said, motioning for Van Melsen to take a look. And then the investigator was in my face, his smoky breath assailing me, his dark eyes fixed upon mine. "Close your eyes," he instructed, and I obeyed. Immediately I saw shapes, circles, dozens of circles, interconnected circles like the Ouroboros, circles just like those Moore had sketched in the kitchen the night before. Standing there, the occasional gust of wind assaulting me from the plain below, I listened as Van Melsen once again muttered something incoherent under his breath. I felt a cold hand take hold of mine, a stiff, bony hand, a hand that could only belong to the investigator. I heard footsteps, assuredly those of the girl, moving into position beside me, the rustling of paper as she extracted something from her handbag. What's going... I began, but was cut short, disturbed by the shuffling of a third body, not Van Melsen, whose hand clutched mine, not Moore, who continued to rustle the sheet of paper she held, but a dumpy, diminutive someone, or something, whose awkward loping and repellent squelching to the rear of me set my heart racing. This thing came closer and closer, loping and squelching. As the parade of circles came and went before my closed eyes, I could almost visualize the thing's limbs, fat and squat, reaching, groping in the gloom and the chill, and the heat of its effort, the sweat of its toil beset my ailing senses, senses that demanded to be muffled. And then the silence, total, terrible silence, a silence that was all the more terrible given my position at the edge of the fell, my upright position above the rocks and the barren plain, my hand still clutched by another, and the circles that still danced and swirled before my eyes. It was the same painful silence as before, a silence that threatened to inflict agonizing pain and suffering on whoever disturbed it. Cut off from sound in that dreadful moment, I turned to what remained. The hand clasped in mine yielded nothing. Touch was of no use at all. Breath might have told me more, through scent or taste, but the risk of making the slightest noise forbade it. That left me with but one sense, and to it I was obliged to commit myself entirely. Slowly, As though the act was akin to dragging open a rusty old gate, I opened my eyes, hoping that the face waiting to greet mine would belong to the paranormal investigator, Peter Van Melsen. It was the face of Van Melsen, but it was flat and expressionless, frozen. A puff of smoke lingered in the air above his motionless head, and by his side, her hand still clutching a piece of crumpled paper, more similarly frozen. And to my rear, unseen but undoubtedly there, that alien, amorphous thing, moving, slithering inexorably towards me. But I'm going to pause here, because it may interest you to know that Moore likewise made a note of these strange events. Her testimony will help to clarify what happened, and so I'll set it down as follows. Part 2. Ellen Moore's Account. I'm going to write about quiet places, still spaces, pockets of silence. I had a dream a few nights ago, a dream of moors, a dark cliff, my friend Peter, and a total stranger, and total silence, of course. Peter and I are attuned. I don't know what it is about the two of us, but things just seem to make sense when we're together. I've wrote about this stuff before, I know, but some things need to be reiterated. Significant things. The morning after the dream, I called him. He seemed to have been expecting me. We talked about the dream, specifically the silence, and it soon became apparent that the dream was linked to a call Peter had received the day before, a call from a lady in Buxton who had experienced something strange while walking her dog in the Peak District. A dream of moors, a dark cliff. Peter and I met in York. We often meet in York. The city's my favorite place in the whole world, despite the weird things that have happened to me there. We discussed a plan of action over one too many cups of Darjeeling at Della Vega's. Correction, Della Vega's tea room is my favorite place in the whole world. Thanks for all the tea, Paul. Peter was pretty tight-lipped on the finer details, seemed to indicate that there was a bigger picture, but I had no problem with that. I knew he'd fill me in when the time was right. The following day, we took a train to Wakefield. There was a house, Peter said, within the walls of which something similar to what the lady in Buxton had reported was rumoured to exist. A pocket of silence, he called it. I thought of my dream, the strange and total silence I encountered on the moors. The term resonated with me. The house in Wakefield was easily found. It was a crumbling red brick affair, surrounded by high, ivy-clad walls. A massive iron gate stood out front. Its hinges were shot, and the way it sagged told of more trespassers than I could count. We made our way to the back of the building, crunching through clumps of dead yellow grass. The rear of the house seemed to have fared better than the front. A cross-section of the east wing looked to be in reasonably good condition, despite the lack of glass in the window frames. Making our way inside, mindful of the hazardous debris that littered the place, we found what we were looking for in a room on the ground floor, a parlor of some kind. "It's here," Peter said, standing by the remains of a large fireplace. "Right here," he added, indicating a heavily tarnished rug, riddled with holes and bits of old timber. So followed one of Peter's rituals, a process he said would eliminate the pocket, or at the very least eradicate the danger it posed. He sprinkled some dust from a small tin on the rug, a combination of wolfsbane and something else I can't recall right now, mumbled something under his breath, then turned to me, insisting I do the same. He handed me a small notebook, a cheap-looking thing with unevenly spaced lines crossing the pages. The phrase I read aloud was in French, "Que l'auditeur trouve la paix," meaning, "May the listener find peace." But I didn't experience anything then, no extraordinary silence, just the general hum and drone of an abandoned house on a relatively busy street. "Job's a good 'un," Peter said, attempting a Yorkshire accent. I shook my head in disgust. Long story short, our visit to the house on Cheapside was a necessary precursor to our next planned stop, Miller's Manor, the location of the dreadful massacre that occurred over the 12 days of Christmas, 1989-90. According to Peter, there was a pocket of silence in the library, being almost identical to the phenomenon we'd almost encountered in Wakefield. There's nothing I can say about Miller's Manor that hasn't already been said 100 times. Some places just speak for themselves. And from the moment I saw that Georgian monstrosity from the window of the taxi, I could practically hear the voices of the damned bellowing. Believe me, I know what those voices sound like. The placement of the windows, like huge black eyes. The bulk of the front door, like a broad, frowning mouth. The numerous chimneys, like an assortment of pointed ears. Miller's Manor was never destined to be a happy home. These days, the place is mostly avoided, with the exception, naturally, of the sort of thrill-seekers who can't resist brushing up against pure evil. The new owner, a wealthy businesswoman who keeps herself well out of sight, had recently begun welcoming guests again, though only on a very selective basis. It was through her, Mrs. Smith, that Peter managed to book a couple of rooms in that house of horrors. I can't say I was looking forward to it. We hadn't been indoors more than a minute, letting ourselves in by means of a key procured from a well-hidden key safe, when another guest arrived at the house. This, we soon discovered, was John Duffy, a Buxton journalist, visiting the mansion on business, a heavy-looking digital camera hanging by his waist. He reminded me of one of my old lecturers, Dr. Monroe, a 40-something with big brown eyes and thick-rimmed glasses, shaggy hair, grey at the temples, tall, lean, and quite handsome. I scowled at him. I'd learned to be suspicious of lone individuals in such places, despite the not-so-suspicious-looking lanyard and accompanying ID card thrown around his neck. Eyeing Peter, he said he recognized him and knew of his work. Not surprising, really. Peter's been in the spotlight quite a bit since that whole Hamerton horror business came to light. And then he asked to tag along. Or did he offer to, as though he'd be providing some vital service? I reckon his familiarity with Peter was the reason he did so. Small-town journalists have a habit of jumping down his throat. The PI is very amiable, though, because he knows that your average Joe will flee at the first sign of danger. It's happened before. So we went about our business, trailed by the busybody. "This is the place," Peter said, stepping into a large rectangular space over 2 levels, filled to the brim on all sides with thousands of books. "Listen long and hear my song," he muttered, as he made his way towards the center of the room. And it was with the mumbling of those infamous words that it all became very clear to me that terror was the common denominator here. Had the terrible tragedy at Miller's Manor directly resulted in the phenomenon we were pursuing? Had something equally ghastly occurred at the crumbling house on Cheapside? On the journey from Wakefield, Peter had said, "I have a feeling, Ellen, a feeling that things are going to escalate. If 44 Cheapside was our starter, then Miller's Manor is the main course." "What does that make Black Edge?" I asked. "Dessert?" Peter smirked, waving a finger back and forth in front of his face. "I should have opted for a better metaphor," he said, chuckling. "The truth is," he went on, "I'm not sure what we'll find at Black Edge. I only know that what we've achieved thus far, and will hopefully achieve at Miller's Dale, will serve to protect us thereafter." John Duffy watched as we went about our business in the library. A handful of candles were lit, another pinch of the wolfsbane compound was sprinkled about the place, and we each recited the phrase in French, "May the listener find peace." But this time it was different. The pocket wasn't restricted to a single spot. Peter had sensed this, and had prepared us for what was to follow. Suddenly, a tangible wave of silence washed over me. It was a broad wave, all-consuming. I literally felt it hit me. Held by it, I was afraid to move, afraid to breathe. The very idea of breaking the silence worried me. It would hurt to break it. It would hurt a lot. Strange circles danced across my field of vision. Big ones, small ones, some connected like the infinity symbol. I was on pins. standing there like a statue, eyeballing Peter, willing him to do something. But, and I thank God, it didn't last. It swiftly receded, no doubt succumbing to the unusual conditions established by my friend. He looked at me then, and smiled. "Job's a good 'un," he said, and lit a cigarette. But I was shaken to the core. Later, the three of us ate together in the kitchen. Peter and John discussed everything under the sun, but I was lost in my thoughts. I drank the wine. I needed the wine. But I found myself compelled to sketch. Not in the way I'd been compelled to sketch all those years ago, but due to the images seemingly imprinted on my retinas. Circles, lots of circles, expanding circles, shrinking circles, all encompassed in a giant circle. I had to get them down on paper before they faded. I was looking for patterns, geometric patterns, anything familiar. But the shapes seemed utterly random, and I was at a loss to explain them. Peter was at a loss, too. Though a certain look in his eye told me that he had his suspicions. Oh, how typical of him to keep his uncertainties to himself. We turned in early. Peter had us up at 3, and he was adamant we'd need every bit of rest before facing Black Edge. I'm relieved to say that I fell asleep almost instantly, despite being aware of the name above the door to my room. I don't know what happened to the man who was given the code name Nightcrawler back in 1989, and for that I was thankful. But I was very familiar with the name above Peter's door, Blue Bottle, a.k.a. Richard Ike. Doesn't bear thinking about, really, does it? The look on John Duffy's face when Mr. Rutherford arrived the following morning was one I won't quickly forget. A mix of shock and apprehension, which I can fully appreciate. Mr. Rutherford belongs to the same world as Peter, a man out of time, providing necessary services to those in need. I've had the pleasure of his company on several occasions, though it has to be noted, I've yet to hear the man speak. He transferred us to Dove Holes in a little over 10 minutes, and promptly left the three of us to our own devices. Once again, the journalist's expression was priceless, the look of a man still trying to figure out how he'd ended up in such a mess. As Peter led us towards Black Edge, John kept glancing over his shoulder, part of him, I think, weighing the wisdom of turning back. Later, I'd learn it was something else, the nagging sense that we were being watched, maybe even followed. It was very dark off the main road. I suppose that's why they called it Dark Peak. So dark that the light from Peter's torch did little to improve our lot. The night was still, but it wasn't silent. Not yet. I heard an owl, the soft pad of tiny paws, scuttling, the whispers of the early hours, soft draughts of wind, all accompanied by our heavy trudging through the shallow undergrowth. Peter was notably quiet. He'd had very little to say all morning. This, I knew, meant that he was especially wary of our surroundings, that he was absorbing the environment, seeking his target with absolute focus. He mumbled once or twice, indistinct phrases in French that I barely detected. I don't think John heard a thing. He was far too focused on the steadily encroaching blackness behind him. And when we reached Black Edge itself, darkness surrounded us completely. Peter flicked his torch on and off, assessing the totality of the shadow world we occupied. When the torch was off, it was as though we stood at the bottom of a very deep cave. Not a slither of light reached our struggling eyes. "This way," Peter said, indicating the southerly path along the ridge. Trusting his instincts, I followed, ensuring John was still with us. It was hard going. I slipped and tripped repeatedly. My eyes were glued to the bouncing beam of light in front of Peter, trying not to think about the sheer overhang just a few feet away. Black Edge, how appropriate. The hush of the night had intensified, I noticed. The reassuring night sounds were no longer audible, just the crunching of our boots on the gravel underfoot. And then, quite abruptly, the journalist barked, "Peter!" Peter and I stopped, turned to face him. "What is it, John?" Peter asked, shining the torch at his feet so as not to blind him. The face above that light was a ghastly pale, a bewildered expression clinging to it. "It's just," he said in a trembling voice, "I feel like we're not alone up here." I didn't like the sound of that. "Go on," Peter said. "I sense something. It's back there," he said, indicating the gloom to his rear. Terror radiated from him. I moved closer. I wanted to reassure him that he was among friends, but the startled look on his face was just awful to see. "Peter," I said, summoning my friend. I took a step back as Peter examined him. "Close your eyes," he said, and John complied. "Que l'auditeur trouve la paix," Peter uttered once again, and then he clutched John's hand. "Ellen," he went on under his breath, "the sketches." And I pulled the requested sheets from my handbag, the circles I'd drawn the night before at Miller's Manor. "What's going on?" I heard John murmur, before resuming his silence, a brand new look of terror filling his features. He seemed to freeze on the spot, with the exception of his head that seemed to tremble slightly, his glasses fogging over. And then, and this is the weirdest thing of all, he did freeze. And as he did, the silence washed over me, that dreadful silence we had been foolishly searching for. And this time it was infinitely worse, like a heavy, padded blanket pressing against my skin, carrying with it the vile sensation of ice-cold fingers grazing the most sensitive parts of my body. I couldn't move, immobile as a statue, my stance the feminine reflection of the journalist. And, as I forced my eyes to scan my surroundings, I saw Peter in a likewise state. The silence, that heavy padded blanket, it tightened about me, provoking me. And I sensed there was a presence at the back of it, a grey, malevolent consciousness with some malign purpose. I refused to move, refused to yield to its monstrous advances. And all the while the silence squeezed and squeezed, until circles appeared again, strange, dancing, big and small, much clearer this time, many of them forming connected pairs. John Duffy screamed, shattering the silence. It was a horrible, shrill scream that felt like razor blades cutting into my skin. But as the silence broke, a flood of darkness surged in to claim the void, and I was swept along with it, seized by an unseen tide and borne away by a faceless black mass that filled every corner of my sight. I don't know what happened after that, because I passed out. When I awoke, I was dimly aware of a reddish glare above my head. I was lying on a gravel path, looking up at a pink sky. I felt like a sailor washed up on a tropical island, lost to mankind, but grateful for my survival. Peter was lying next to me, and, much to my relief, so was the journalist, the two of them gazing at the soothing sky. And that's as much as I can recall. I'll have to leave it to Peter to fill in the blanks. Part 3. Peter Van Melsen's account. My good friend, Ellen Moore, and the Buxton journalist, John Duffy, have insisted that I provide an account of the strangeness that occurred at Black Edge. Well, in order to provide a satisfactory explanation, I must take the reader back over 12 months. In February of 2019, I received a letter from a Wakefieldian by the name of Timothy Gardner regarding an unusual experience on Cheapside. Gardner, an amateur ghost hunter, was sleuthing about an old house, responding to numerous reports of an apparition said to be roaming the ruined halls. The rumor went that a murder had taken place there before the house was abandoned. Nothing of the sort appeared in any official record, but dilapidated mansions have a way of attracting such tales. Gardner was disappointed by the lack of ghosts at 44 Cheapside, but noted a curious pocket of silence, a spot in the house that seemed to be preternaturally charged, leaving the would-be investigator startled and discombobulated. Anyway, I made a note of Gardner's report, highlighting the so-called pockets of silence. Later, I found an entry in Julian Terence Corrett's Mystical Marks that seemed to describe such a thing. Quiet patches, oppressive and highly localized regions devoid of sound, in which those unfortunate enough to stumble are arrested by an overbearing sensitiveness to external stimulus. Curious. But that was as much as I looked into the subject, until December. Another report came my way. The suspicious disappearance of Richard Icke, the supposed sole survivor of the 1989-90 Miller's Manor massacre. The particulars of that dreadful episode are widely available, so I won't go into any great detail here. But suffice it to say that Icke's disappearance from his home in Chesterfield, some 30 years after those terrible events in the Peaks, seemed to coincide eerily with the discovery of another pocket of silence within the walls of Miller's Manor. An unlucky sightseer claimed to have been thoroughly disturbed by the phenomenon in the mansion's lofty library, describing it as an intimidating silence that seemed to clasp her in a vice-like grip. Again, I made a note of this report, comparing it with Timothy Gardner's, and spent many an hour contemplating the significance of these unusual experiences. Another couple of months slipped by, and a third report concerning a pocket of silence came my way. This time I listened to the rattled tones of a Buxton hiker, who had called me directly to discuss the great silence she'd encountered at Black Edge, a silence that wasn't there before, a silence that filled her with dread. 3 reports, 3 good reasons to launch an investigation. An alleged murder in Wakefield, a near dozen murders in Miller's Dale, oppressive silences arising in both locations, threatening silences. Further forays into my extensive book collection led to the discovery of an article in Arkwright's Cycle titled Concentrated Acts of Evil and the Results of Such on the Corporeal. Arkwright's article suggests that sufficiently vicious acts of violence can leave a mark on the physical environment, or rather, a void vulnerable to incorporeal incursion. Simply put, the opening of rifts through which entities from other realities might gain access to ours. What, then, assuming I was on the right track with Arkwright's article, might have happened in the remote reaches of the Peak District to create such a rift in the middle of nowhere? I searched the records closely, but found nothing of consequence tied to Black Edge. No acts of violence, no untimely deaths, at least none that history had bothered to keep. Either way, I felt it my duty to at least attempt to do away with these curious pockets. I'd seen enough incorporeal incursions over the years to know that these peculiarities posed a rather substantial risk to those unfortunate enough to encounter them. With the advent of Ellen's troubling dream, I knew the two of us were to venture south together, and so we met in York. We discussed my half-baked theories, but I kept the specifics to myself. My instincts told me this was the best course, minimizing Ellen's exposure to whatever might prey upon these strange phenomena. Armed with an assortment of fine powders and notes taken from Mystical Marks, I felt I was sufficiently prepared to eradicate the pockets, providing, of course, the pockets were still empty. 44 Cheapside proved to be a straightforward affair. In and out we were, minimally affected by the phenomenon. This was the reasoning behind arranging the visits in such a way, progressing from the lesser to the greater, to acclimatize to the sensation, to make it bearable. I feared that whatever lay in wait at Black Edge would prove too much without such preparation. Miller's Manor, too, was simple enough, though I'm well aware Ellen seemed to bear the brunt of it. I was thankful for our introduction to Mr. Duffy then, as his presence seemed to diffuse the focus of that which lay at the back of the phenomena. And so we come to the main event. Under the unnatural darkness that shrouded Black Edge, I was largely unaware of what was transpiring behind me. Ellen was undisturbed, but Mr. Duffy, completely out of his depth, had become the object of some otherworldly force's attention. It seems that this thing, whatever it was, had caught a glimpse of me in Wakefield, had heard my voice as I dispersed the silence at Miller's Manor. And it had learned something in the process, learned of our planned visit to Black Edge, followed us there, attached itself to the weakest link, John Duffy. And though it wouldn't be able to interact with him or any of us outside a pocket of sufficient size, it would be very difficult to shake, almost impossible, in fact, when, there at Black Edge, we stumbled into the great silence. The thing or force would have taken possession of Mr. Duffy if it hadn't been for the acclimatization I spoke of, the subtle conditioning that allowed me to overcome the crippling effects of the phenomenon. I tore my way through a black cloud, reaching as I did so into my satchel. Blindly, I withdrew the last handful of horn dust and tossed it into the air. In cracked tones, I blurted that invaluable incantation, as noted by Roger Arkwright over a century ago. The dust rained down on my head, like billions of stars cascading from the heavens. This I saw in slow motion, held as I was by the extraordinary force of the pressing silence. Shapes moved in the night, dark shadows swept over me like waves, and I realized that the pocket was evaporating, like the vestiges of a once great lake in a vast desert. Not a sound did I hear, and not a sensation did I feel, just the steady dissipation of something sinister and unnatural. And then it was gone, just like that. What it was that sought to seize Mr. Duffy, I never fully perceived. I caught a blur in the gloom, a shape without definite form, a color without color. But I heard a voice I'd heard before, and the recognition of that voice told me just how close I'd come to destruction. The journalist was a means to an end. The thing that had come for him was he who I had banished 10 years before, he who hadn't forgotten me, and who sought me still, the figure in grey, Teterox. What form he'd assumed in that outer realm of non-existence, I hadn't a clue. But it certainly wasn't a human form. But of all the revelations that night, I learned something of a special significance, the name of Teterox, the monster's true name before he became the figure in grey. The pale man with the expressionless face, deep-set eyes, horribly disfigured nose, and that ghastly, gaping, lipless mouth had once been a cult leader by the name of Edmund Fairfax, a shadowy Englishman responsible for the creation of the Followers of the 100 Words. What, then, I repeat, might have happened in the remote reaches of the Peak District to create a vast pocket of silence in the middle of nowhere? On a black, moonless, cloud-covered night, Fairfax led his congregation into the gloom of Dark Peak, trudged through the grass to the ridgeline of Black Edge, held communion by the light of 100 candles, then invited his devotees to follow him into the abyss. 57 people died that night, all of whom plunged to their deaths from a precipitous outcrop. Some died on impact, others lay bleeding for days, succumbing to their wounds, or to the ravenous appetites of opportunistic buzzards. Fairfax himself achieved some sort of transcendence. He became an ethereal necromancer, summoned by the weak and the desperate, a reanimator of the dead, a predator of the living. His terrible sacrifice, it seems, provided a means by which he might return once again to the land of the corporeal, a great pocket of silence, evading the banishment I bestowed upon him 10 years before at the abandoned Fletcher Mill. But for now, he's trapped again, a victim of his own wrongdoings. As for the circles Ellen drew, and those Mr. Duffy saw when he closed his eyes, I can only think of the Figure 8 ritual, the very ritual that sent Teterox to oblivion. Echoes across the void, an inversion perhaps. With regards to this, I can only speculate. I was very pleased to find both Ellen and Mr. Duffy in one piece when I awoke from that strange displacement. But I must urge that anyone encountering these phenomena be mindful, report them, for terrible things are seeking them, always. Afterword by John Duffy. 3 perspectives, 1 story. I don't know how I feel about having been part of it. There are, without doubt, forces abroad that threaten to unravel what we think of as reality. If nothing else, I hope that sharing this account lends some support to those whose own strange experiences have been met with doubt or disbelief. We haven't solved anything here. Not really, but I can tell you this for sure. There's one less skeptic in the world. Having read the investigator's account, I took it upon myself to do some further reading concerning Edmund Fairfax, a resident of Buxton no less, whose lineage is as mysterious as the man himself. Seems he lived in a large mansion on Marlborough Road, the apparent headquarters of the followers of the 100 Words, a property that to this day sits in quiet seclusion, its current owners equally mysterious. And that's about it on the subject. I'll close with the 100 Words. Is it significant that the word count totals 99? I found a record of them in Buxton Library. They make for interesting reading. We gather beneath the shroud of deepest night, where the world's clamour is subdued and the twitching tongue is stilled. Darkness is our sanctuary, for in deepest shadow all distractions perish, and in deepest silence all bonds are loosened. Speech binds man to earth, noise chains the soul to flesh. But when deepest silence reigns, the veil thins, and the spirit prepares for departure. Thus we hallow the hush of deepest midnight, and extinguish every light, awaiting the blessed stillness wherein mortal weight dissolves. For only in silence shall the faithful be unburdened, only in silence allowing for ascension.
If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time.